$10,500,000. The colossal string of digits lay motionless on the phone screen, casting a sickly pale blue glow across the dead silent room. After 7 years of gambling my life, my youth, and countless sleepless nights to resurrect a clean energy startup from the ashes, I had finally sold it. I should have been screaming. I should have been weeping with joy, but no. The only thing rising in my chest right now was a hollow, freezing abyss. I looked up. Daniel, my cousin, a former soldier with eyes sharp as scalpels, was leaning against the kitchen counter, arms crossed. He was the sole witness to this moment. No celebratory hug, no beaming smile. Daniel watched me the way a tactician studies a minefield right before detonation. "Calling the family?" I muttered, my thumb hovering hesitantly over the contact list. "Don't." Daniel's voice cut through the silence, low and brutally definitive. "Don't tell them you won. Tell them you lost everything." I let out a bark of laughter, a dry, shattered sound. "Are you out of your mind?" But Daniel's gaze didn't waver. He stepped forward, tapping a slow, deliberate rhythm on the countertop. "Miranda, open your eyes. You have never seen their true faces without your checkbook in the picture. What happens when they think the gold mine has run dry?" His question was a bucket of ice water straight to the psyche. I am Miranda Cole, 33 years old. I had sacrificed my youth to engineer self-regenerating energy cells, yet I had been foolish enough to let my own family drain my lifeblood until I was entirely depleted. My older sister, Elaine, always cloaked herself in the aura of a grand visionary, squandering fortunes on hollow projects using my blood, sweat, and tears. And my mother? She was a religious fanatic at the altar of appearances. In her eyes, I was never a daughter in need of an embrace. I was an instrument, the perfect ATM, engineered solely to fund the velvet curtain that hid this rotting family from the world. That night, after Daniel left, I sat slumped in the suffocating dark. A pathetic, lingering fragment of my soul still yearned to dial my mother's number, begging just to hear, "I am proud of you." But the other half, the cold, rational side that had been bruised one too many times, screamed the brutal truth. My success, in their eyes, was nothing but fresh meat. By the next morning, the trap was officially set. There was no $10.5 million. From this exact second forward, I was bankrupt, drowning in debt and utterly desperate. I picked up the phone and dialed her number. I deliberately dropped my voice, injecting it with the perfect pitch of exhaustion and trembling panic. "Mom, could you and Elaine come over for lunch this Sunday? There's something incredibly important and terrible that I need to tell you." She agreed instantly, but not out of maternal concern for my impending ruin. "All right, but make sure to roast the rack of lamb. I've been craving it lately, and pick up a nice, expensive bottle of red wine, the vintage Elaine likes. Let's do this properly, don't be so sloppy." Her shrill voice echoed through the receiver, permanently severing the very last thread of hope I had left for them. "Yes, Mom," I replied, the corner of my mouth curling into a slow, ice-cold smile. The screen went black, mirroring a pair of unfamiliar eyes I no longer recognized as my own. The fear had evaporated, replaced by a ruthless, calculating curiosity. This Sunday lunch wasn't going to be a family gathering. It was going to be an autopsy. I woke up earlier than usual the next morning, not because I couldn't sleep, but because something inside me had settled into a kind of quiet focus I hadn't felt in years. The decision was already made, the plan already in motion, and for the first time, I wasn't reacting to my family. I was observing them. I made coffee, sat at my kitchen table, and opened my laptop, not to work, but to look back. I pulled up my financial records from the past few years and began scrolling slowly, not searching for anything specific, just letting the patterns reveal themselves. Transfers labeled as short-term help appeared more often than I remembered, each one followed by silence, no repayment, no acknowledgement, just the assumption that it had been handled. I clicked into my credit statements and saw charges tied to my mother's authorized card. Purchases that had nothing to do with emergencies, travel bookings, retail stores, things I had never questioned before because questioning them would have felt like breaking some unspoken rule. 2 years earlier, Elaine had come to me with what she called a small opportunity, something she needed quick funding for, just enough to get started. I remember how fast I agreed, how natural it felt to transfer the money without asking for details. That same week at a family gathering, I overheard my mother telling relatives that Elaine had the vision in the family, that she was the one who thought big, while I was simply the one who handled money well. I didn't say anything at the time, but I remember how that sentence stayed with me longer than it should have. Back in the present, I closed the financial files and leaned back in my chair, letting the silence in the room settle again. It wasn't one event, it wasn't one request, it was a system, and I had been part of it for so long that I stopped recognizing it as something separate from love. That realization didn't feel dramatic. It felt quiet, almost clinical, and that made it harder to ignore. I moved through the rest of the morning preparing for Sunday lunch, ordering food, setting the table, arranging everything the way I always did when my family came over. Nothing about the process was new, but the way I experienced it was. I wasn't trying to make them comfortable, I was creating a controlled environment. Every detail felt intentional, even the timing. My phone buzzed on the counter, breaking the rhythm. I picked it up and saw a message from Elaine, a document attached with a short line underneath. "Take a look before Sunday. Timing is critical." There was no greeting, no question, nothing that suggested she remembered I had said I needed to talk about something important. I opened the file anyway and skimmed through it. The numbers were polished, the language confident, but something about it felt exaggerated, projections stretched just far enough to look convincing without being grounded. I didn't analyze it deeply. I didn't need to. I already understood what it represented. A second notification appeared, this time from my mother. She reminded me to make sure there was enough food for everyone, mentioned a dish she hadn't had in a while, and added that she wanted to discuss something important regarding a recent purchase. Again, no question about me, no reference to my call, just expectation layered over assumption. I read the message twice before setting my phone back down. As the day moved forward, I found myself thinking less about what I was going to say and more about what I was going to watch. Every interaction I had with them in the past followed a pattern. They spoke, they needed, and I responded. I had never stepped outside that sequence before, never paused long enough to see it from a distance. Now that I had, it was impossible to unsee. Before leaving to pick up the food, I opened Elaine's proposal again and looked at it more carefully. The urgency, the scale, the expectation that I would step in without hesitation, it was all there, woven into the structure of the document itself. It wasn't a request, it was a continuation of something that had already been established. I checked the time, grabbed my keys, and stood still for a moment longer than necessary. There was still a part of me that hoped something would be different, that maybe this time someone would notice the shift, ask a different question, respond in a way that didn't revolve around what I could provide. I didn't push that thought away, but I didn't hold on to it either. When I returned home and finished setting everything up, the house looked exactly like it always did before family gatherings, warm, organized, familiar. The difference was in me. I wasn't preparing to host, I was preparing to observe. The first knock on the door came right on time, and as I walked toward it, I realized something that hadn't been clear before. For the first time, I wasn't stepping into a role they expected from me, I was stepping out of it, and whatever happened next would show me exactly what had been there all along. The door opened and Elaine stepped in first, her eyes moving quickly across the room before landing on me for just a second, long enough to acknowledge I was there, not long enough to read anything else. She set her bag down on the chair like she had done it 100 times before, already settling in, already comfortable, as if the space belonged to her just as much as it did to me. My mother followed behind her, pausing only to glance at the table and comment on the food before saying anything resembling a greeting. We moved through the first few minutes the way we always did. Small talk, familiar routines, the kind of conversation that sounds warm but carries no real weight. Elaine mentioned how busy things had been for her lately, hinting at new opportunities without explaining them, while my mother talked about her recent purchase with a kind of pride that filled the room. No one asked why I had called them there. No one asked if something was wrong. The question I had been waiting for never came. When we sat down, the shift happened quickly. Elaine reached into her bag, pulled out a folder, and placed it on the table between us with a sense of purpose that cut through everything else. She opened it and slid a set of documents toward me, her tone changing from casual to focused in a matter of seconds. She began explaining her plan, an eco-resort project on the coast, positioned as a limited opportunity with high return potential. Her voice was steady, confident, practiced, as if she had already presented it multiple times and expected the same outcome here. She spoke about timing, about competition, about the importance of moving quickly before the opportunity disappeared. The numbers she referenced sounded impressive, the projections carefully framed to emphasize growth and success. But there was something about the way she presented them that felt more like persuasion than analysis. She didn't ask if I was interested. She spoke as if I already was, as if my role in the plan had already been decided. Kyle sat beside her, nodding at the right moments, adding small comments that reinforced her points without introducing anything new. He didn't explain the operational side, didn't address risks, didn't question the scale. His presence supported the pressure rather than the substance, and I noticed how easily that dynamic formed, how naturally they worked together to guide the conversation in one direction. Before I could respond, my mother leaned forward, shifting the focus entirely. She began describing the land she had recently purchased, the location, the size, the potential it held. Her words carried a different kind of energy, less about numbers and more about image, about what it would look like when everything was finished. She spoke about the house she planned to build, how it would reflect on the family, how important it was that everything be done properly, not just for comfort, but for reputation. Then, almost without transition, she moved into expectation. She said it made sense for me to help cover the costs, that this was the kind of situation where family supports each other. The way she said it wasn't a request. It was a conclusion, something already decided, something I was simply expected to accept. Elaine picked up the momentum immediately, bringing the conversation back to her project, emphasizing how both opportunities required quick action. Their voices began to overlap, not in disagreement, but in alignment, each reinforcing the idea that I was the solution to what they needed. The pressure wasn't aggressive, it was structured, layered, designed to move forward without pause. I stayed quiet, letting the conversation continue, watching how easily it unfolded without my input. Elaine glanced at me and said, almost casually, "You've always been the stable one when it comes to money," the kind of sentence that sounds like recognition but functions as expectation. It landed in the room like it had been said many times before, familiar, unquestioned. I looked around the table and realized something that should have been obvious earlier. Not one of them had asked why I called them there. Not one of them had paused long enough to consider that I might have something to say that wasn't about what they needed. Everything in the room was moving in one direction, and it had nothing to do with me. I placed my hands flat on the table and let the silence cut through their conversation. It didn't take long for them to notice. Their voices stopped, their attention shifted, and for a brief moment everything aligned around me. But even then I could see it in their expressions. They weren't waiting to hear something unexpected. They were waiting for my answer. I took a slow breath, steadying my voice before I spoke. For the first time in years, I wasn't about to agree. I wasn't about to adjust, and I wasn't about to continue the pattern they had come to rely on. I was about to remove the one thing they had always expected from me, and I wanted to see what would happen when it was no longer there. I looked at each of them for a moment longer than usual, long enough for the expectation in their eyes to settle into something sharper. And then I spoke. I told them my company had run into a serious issue with our battery systems, that there were safety concerns we hadn't anticipated, that there was a possibility of recalls and legal action. I kept my voice steady, careful, not rushed, letting each detail land without dramatizing it. At first, they didn't interrupt. They listened, but not in the way I had imagined. It wasn't concern, it was calculation, as if they were already trying to measure what this meant for them before I even finished. I continued, explaining that investors had started pulling back, that the financial pressure was building faster than we could stabilize it, and that I was facing the possibility of losing everything. I added that I didn't know how I was going to manage it, that I might not be able to keep up with obligations, and that I was trying to figure out what to do next. When I said the word bankruptcy, the room shifted completely. It was subtle at first, a tightening in their posture, a glance exchanged between Elaine and Kyle, a slight pause from my mother, but it was enough. For a second, there was silence. It stretched just long enough for me to realize that whatever I had been hoping for wasn't coming. Elaine was the first to speak, and she didn't ask if I was okay. She leaned forward, her expression sharpened, and asked what this meant for her timeline. Her voice had lost its earlier confidence and replaced it with urgency. She wanted to know if my situation would interfere with the funding she had just outlined, if there was any risk that my instability could affect her ability to move forward. I didn't answer right away. I watched her instead, trying to find any sign that she understood what I had just said beyond how it affected her. There wasn't any. She continued, saying that if there was even a chance of financial complications, I needed to make sure my name wasn't attached to anything that could create risk. She mentioned lenders, credibility, exposure, all the things that mattered to her, none of them including me. My mother's reaction came next, slower but colder. She leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms in a way that felt more defensive than concerned. She said I should have been more careful, that taking risks like that always had consequences. When she spoke about the house she planned to build, her tone didn't change. She said the land was already purchased, that it was an opportunity she couldn't afford to compromise, and that I needed to handle my situation without expecting her to adjust her plans. I repeated quietly that I might lose everything, that I didn't know what would happen next, giving them one more chance to respond differently. The words felt heavier the second time, not because of what they meant, but because of what they revealed. Elaine checked her phone while I was speaking, her attention already drifting back to her own concerns. My mother nodded slightly, as if confirming something to herself, not about me, but about her decision. The conversation changed direction quickly, but not toward me. Elaine began talking about what needed to be done to separate any financial overlap, making it clear that she didn't want my situation affecting her plans. My mother mentioned boundaries, responsibilities, and the importance of protecting what each person had built. They spoke as if I wasn't sitting there, as if the situation I had just described was a problem to be managed, not a person to be supported. I stayed quiet through most of it, not because I didn't have anything to say, but because there was nothing left to clarify. Every sentence they spoke removed another layer of doubt I hadn't realized I was holding on to. I wasn't trying to convince them anymore, I was listening, and what I heard was consistent, clear, and impossible to ignore. After a few more minutes, Elaine closed her folder, the same one she had opened with such certainty earlier, and stood up. She said she had things to handle, that timing was critical, and that we would need to revisit everything once my situation was resolved. My mother followed, mentioning other obligations, speaking about schedules and plans that had nothing to do with what I had just told them. They didn't ask if I needed anything. They didn't offer help. They didn't even pause at the door. The exit was quick, efficient, almost practiced, as if leaving was simply the next logical step once I no longer fit the role they expected me to play. When the door closed behind them, the house felt different. The table was still set, the food untouched, everything exactly as it had been before they arrived, but the meaning of it had changed completely. I sat there for a while, not moving, letting the silence settle into something solid. I didn't feel shocked. I didn't feel angry. What I felt was something much quieter, something that didn't need to be processed or explained. It was certainty. And in that moment, I understood that whatever I thought I might lose, I had already lost a long time ago. I just hadn't been willing to see it until now. I woke up the next morning without the heaviness I expected, as if something had already settled during the silence after they left. The conversation from the day before replayed in my mind, but not in fragments or emotion, more like a sequence I was reviewing for clarity. Every reaction had been immediate, every priority exposed without hesitation, and what stayed with me most was not what they said, but how easily they said it. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had already gone cold, thinking about what Daniel had told me. The first test had shown me how they reacted together, how quickly they aligned when the situation no longer benefited them, but I wanted to see what would happen when there was no shared momentum, no overlapping voices, just individual choice. If there was anything different beneath the surface, I would find it there. I didn't call ahead. I drove straight to Elaine's house, the same one she had partially funded with money I transferred without question a few years ago. Her car was parked outside, clean, polished, exactly the way she liked to present things. I sat in my car for a moment before getting out, not hesitating, just taking in the quiet before knocking on the door. When she opened it, her expression was already guarded. She didn't smile, didn't ask me in, just stood there as if she already knew what I was about to say. I kept my tone calm and told her I needed a small favor, something temporary, somewhere to stay for a short time while I figured things out, or even just a small amount to cover immediate expenses. I made it simple on purpose, something that didn't require sacrifice, something that could be given without consequence. She didn't hesitate. She told me she couldn't help, that her resources were already committed, that everything she had was tied up in her project. Her words were precise, controlled, but there was no softness in them. She added that being associated with financial instability could create problems for her, especially with lenders, and that she needed to stay focused on securing her position. I watched her as she spoke, the way she kept one hand on the door, not opening it wider, not stepping aside. She wasn't just refusing, she was containing the interaction, limiting how far it could go. She didn't ask how serious things were, didn't ask if I had anywhere else to go, didn't offer an alternative. It wasn't uncertainty, it was a decision already made. I nodded once, not arguing, not asking again. There was nothing to push against because there was no resistance, just absence. I turned and walked back to my car, the quiet returning in the same way it had the night before, steady, undeniable. The drive to my mother's house felt shorter than usual. I noticed the details as I pulled up, the updated landscaping, the new fixtures near the entrance, small changes that signaled recent spending without needing explanation. When she opened the door, her expression was different from Elaine's, less guarded but not warmer. I explained my situation again, this time in simpler terms, leaving out the details and focusing on what mattered. I told her I needed a small amount to get through the next few weeks, something temporary until I could stabilize things. I kept my voice even, not asking for more than what should have been easy to give. She crossed her arms almost immediately, not aggressively but firmly enough to create distance. She said I needed to take responsibility for what had happened, that I should have planned better, been more cautious. She suggested I sell personal items, cut expenses, do whatever I needed to do to handle it on my own. I noticed the watch on her wrist as she spoke, one I had paid for without ever thinking about it twice. I didn't mention it. I didn't need to. The contradiction was clear without being spoken. She didn't ask where I was staying. She didn't ask what would happen next. She didn't ask if I was okay. Her concern was framed entirely around what I should do, not what she could do. I thanked her for listening, even though she hadn't, and stepped back before she had to close the door. The conversation ended the same way the one with Elaine had, quickly, cleanly, without any space left open for reconsideration. I stood outside for a moment after she went back inside, letting the quiet settle again. There was no disappointment left to process, no expectation waiting to be adjusted. The pattern had repeated itself exactly, not because of the setting, not because of the amount, but because it had always been there. When I got back into my car, I didn't start the engine right away. I sat there with my hands resting on the steering wheel, not thinking about what they had said, but about what it meant. There was nothing left to confirm. By the time I drove home, the decision had already shifted from understanding to action. I placed my phone on the table when I walked in, ignoring the notifications that had started to build, and looked around the room with a clarity I hadn't felt before. I wasn't waiting for them to show up differently anymore. I was deciding what their choices meant, and what I was going to do with that truth. My phone started vibrating before I even opened my eyes. A steady, relentless buzzing against the nightstand that didn't stop long enough to ignore. I reached for it without thinking, expecting something routine, but the screen was filled with notifications stacked on top of each other, messages, missed calls, emails, all arriving at once. For a second, I just stared at it, trying to understand what could have triggered that kind of response overnight. The first message I opened was a link. No explanation, just a headline preview and my name in bold. I tapped it and watched as the article loaded, a major business publication featuring a full breakdown of my company's acquisition. They described the technology, the growth, the negotiation, and finally the number, $10.5 million, confirmed and public. There was even a photo of me from the signing, smiling in a way I barely recognized now. I read the entire article slowly, line by line, taking in how clean everything looked from the outside. It told a complete story: success, innovation, timing, execution. There was no mention of doubt, no mention of hesitation, no mention of the conversation that had taken place just days earlier around my dining table. The contrast was sharp enough to feel physical. By the time I finished reading, my phone had already started ringing again. Elaine's name flashed across the screen first. I watched it for a few seconds before letting it go to voicemail. Then my mother called. Then Elaine again. Then a number I didn't recognize. The pattern repeated itself, back to back, urgency replacing the silence they had left me with. Messages followed just as quickly. Elaine's text came through first, her tone completely different from the last time we spoke. She said she had just seen the article, that she was so proud of me, that she always knew I would succeed. She called me brilliant, driven, unstoppable, words she had never used before, at least not without attaching them to what I could do for her. She added that we needed to talk soon because this changed everything. I scrolled down and saw more messages from her, each one slightly more urgent than the last. She mentioned her project again, but this time indirectly, talking about new possibilities and alignment. The language was softer, but the intention underneath it hadn't changed. My mother's messages were longer. She wrote about family, about how proud she was, about how she had always supported me in her own way. She said she had been thinking about me all week, that she wanted us to come together and celebrate, that nothing mattered more than staying connected. She didn't mention the conversation we had at her door, didn't mention the words she used, didn't acknowledge the distance she had created. It was as if that moment had been rewritten entirely. I listened to one of Elaine's voicemails next. Her voice was different, lighter, almost enthusiastic, but there was a layer of urgency underneath it. She laughed at the beginning, said she couldn't believe how big the news was, then quickly shifted into suggesting we meet, talk through ideas, figure out how to move forward together. The shift was subtle, but it was there, from praise to opportunity in the span of a few sentences. I placed the phone on the table and let it continue vibrating without picking it up again. The contrast between then and now was complete. When they thought I had nothing, there was distance, hesitation, withdrawal. Now that they knew I had everything, there was urgency, warmth, connection. The difference wasn't complicated, it wasn't emotional, it was structural. I sat there for a while, not reacting, not responding, just letting the pattern settle into something I could no longer question. Whatever uncertainty I had carried before was gone. This wasn't about misunderstanding or timing or stress. It was about access. After a few minutes, I reached for my laptop instead of my phone. I opened my email and drafted a message to my lawyer, short, direct, asking for a meeting as soon as possible to review all financial connections tied to my name. I didn't reference the messages, didn't explain the situation. I didn't need to. My phone rang again while I was typing. Elaine's name flashing across the screen for the third or fourth time. I let it ring until it stopped, then continued writing. There was a moment where I considered answering, just to hear what she would say directly, just to see how far the shift would go in conversation instead of text. I paused, my hand resting on the keyboard, and then I closed that thought before it could take shape. I already knew what she would say. I had heard enough. When I finished the email, I sent it without hesitation and closed my laptop. The room was quiet again except for the occasional vibration of my phone, still lighting up, still demanding attention. I turned it face down on the table and left it there. They were finally ready to talk, ready to explain, ready to reconnect, but I wasn't waiting for that anymore. Whatever came next wasn't going to be a conversation. It was going to be a decision. I walked into my lawyer's office the next morning with a kind of calm I didn't recognize in myself, the kind that doesn't come from confidence, but from certainty. The space was quiet, organized, everything in its place, and for the first time in days, nothing felt unpredictable. I sat down across from him, placed my phone on the table without looking at it, and told him I wanted a complete review of every financial connection tied to my name. He didn't ask why. He opened a file, pulled up documents, and began outlining what that meant in practical terms. Authorized users, shared access, informal agreements, any instance where my financial standing had been used as support, direct or implied. As he spoke, I realized how many layers there were, how many small decisions over the years had created a structure I had never fully examined. It wasn't one connection. It was a network. We started with the simplest ones: supplementary credit cards, access permissions, recurring authorizations. I confirmed that I wanted all of them removed immediately. He nodded, typing as I spoke, explaining timelines, processes, and confirmations. There was no emotion in the conversation, just clarity, step by step, action by action. Then we moved into something more complicated. He paused for a moment, looking at one of the documents more closely before turning the screen toward me. My name appeared in a section tied to preliminary financial discussions connected to Elaine's project. It wasn't a formal agreement, not a signed guarantee, but it was there, referenced as support, as stability, as something lenders could consider. I stared at it longer than I needed to, not because I didn't understand it, but because I did. She hadn't just expected my help. She had already built it into her plans. Without asking, without confirming, she had used my position as part of her foundation. I looked back at my lawyer and told him I wanted that removed immediately. Not clarified, not adjusted, removed. He explained what that would involve: formal notifications, written statements, communication with any institution where my name had been mentioned. I agreed to all of it without hesitation. The next step was broader. Any past financial support that could be interpreted as ongoing responsibility needed to be formally closed. He outlined the risks of leaving things as they were, how assumptions could turn into obligations if not addressed. I signed the documents he placed in front of me, one after another, watching as each signature converted something informal into something final. By the time we finished, the structure that had once connected me to their financial world was already beginning to dissolve. Not dramatically, not visibly, but in ways that would matter the most. When I stepped outside, the air felt different, lighter but sharper at the same time. I walked toward my car, keys in hand, already thinking about what needed to be done next when I heard my name behind me. I turned and saw Elaine and my mother standing near the entrance, both of them moving toward me quickly, their expressions urgent, their energy completely different from the last time we stood face to face. Elaine spoke first, her voice rushed, layered with explanation before I even had time to respond. She said she had been trying to reach me, that there had been a misunderstanding, that she hadn't known how serious things were when I told them. My mother stepped in right after her tone softer but no less deliberate. She talked about family, about how we shouldn't let things get out of control, about how important it was to stay connected. She said we needed to sit down and talk, that everything could be worked through if we handled it together. I listened to both of them without interrupting, letting their words fill the space between us. The urgency in their voices wasn't subtle. It was immediate, focused, directed. But it wasn't directed at me, not really. It was directed at what I represented. When they paused, waiting for a response, I kept my tone even. I told them I had already taken the steps I needed to take, that everything connected to my finances had been reviewed and adjusted. I didn't raise my voice, didn't explain the details, just stated it clearly. Elaine's expression changed first. The urgency shifted into something sharper, something closer to panic. She asked what I meant, whether I had contacted lenders, whether anything had been formalized. Her questions came quickly, each one more specific than the last. My mother tried to slow it down, telling me I didn't need to act so quickly, that decisions like this should be made carefully, together. She framed it as concern, as guidance, but the timing made it clear. I told them the decisions were already made, that nothing I had done was reactive, it was corrective, that I wasn't removing anything that had been agreed upon, I was removing what had never been mine to carry in the first place. They both started speaking at the same time then. Questions, explanations, attempts to reframe what had happened over the past few days. I didn't respond to all of it. I didn't need to. I stepped past them and walked toward my car, unlocking the door without looking back. Their voices followed me, calling my name, asking me to wait, to talk, to reconsider. I paused for just a second with my hand on the door, not to turn around, but to let the moment settle into something final. I got in, closed the door, and started the engine. As I pulled out of the parking space, I saw them in the mirror, still standing there, still trying to understand something that was already done. I didn't take anything from them. I just stopped giving, and for the first time, that was enough to change everything. The quiet that followed wasn't empty. It was steady, the kind of quiet that doesn't ask anything from you. I woke up the next morning, and for the first time in a long time, there was nothing waiting for me to fix, nothing hovering over me that required an immediate response. My phone was still there on the table, still lighting up occasionally, but it no longer felt urgent. It felt distant, like something that belonged to another version of my life. The messages didn't stop completely. They shifted. What had started as urgency turned into persistence, and then into something softer. Occasional check-ins, carefully worded apologies, subtle attempts to reopen a conversation that had already been closed. Elaine sent a few more messages over the next couple of days, less direct than before, but still circling the same idea: reconnect, talk, figure things out. My mother's messages leaned more emotional, talking about family, about how things shouldn't stay unresolved, about how important it was to move forward together. I didn't respond. Not because I wanted to punish them, not because I wanted them to feel what I felt, but because I understood something I hadn't understood before. Silence, in this case, wasn't distance, it was protection. Every time I had responded in the past, I had stepped back into a pattern that never changed. This time, I chose not to step back in. I thought about what I had actually lost, and the answer came to me in a way that surprised me. I didn't lose my family in that week. I lost the version of them I had created in my mind, the version that made everything make sense, the version that allowed me to keep giving without questioning why. Once that version was gone, what remained was clearer, simpler, and harder to ignore. The people who stood by me during that time weren't the ones I had spent years trying to support. Daniel checked in without asking for anything, just making sure I was steady. A close friend of mine showed up with food and stayed longer than she needed to, not to solve anything, but to be there. None of it was dramatic. None of it was complicated, but it was consistent. It didn't depend on what I could provide. I heard updates about my family through others, not directly. Elaine's project had slowed down once my name was removed from the conversation. The urgency she once carried turned into pressure she now had to manage on her own. My mother's plans shifted as well, not stopped but adjusted, restructured around what was actually available rather than what had been assumed. I didn't feel satisfaction when I heard these things. I felt distance. What stayed with me most wasn't what happened to them, it was what changed in me. For years, I thought strength meant continuing to support, continuing to show up, continuing to give even when it felt uneven. What I learned instead was that strength sometimes looks like stopping, not abruptly, not emotionally, but clearly. I thought back to the moment I first saw the $10.5 million in my account, how uncertain I felt, how I hesitated before sharing it. I had believed that moment was about success, about reaching a milestone, about proving something. Now I understood it differently. It wasn't about what I had gained, it was about what I finally saw. I didn't need to prove anything to them. I didn't need to explain my decisions or justify my boundaries. The only thing I needed to do was decide who had access to me, and for the first time, that decision felt entirely mine. I didn't take anything away from them. I didn't create their situation or force their choices. I simply stopped being the solution they relied on, and without that, everything revealed itself exactly as it was. If you've made it this far, I want to ask you something. If you suddenly had everything you worked for, real success, real security, would you trust that the people around you see you, or would you want to know the truth the way I did? If this story felt familiar in any way, or if you've ever had to choose between keeping the peace and protecting yourself, I'd really like to hear your thoughts. Share your experience in the comments because stories like this aren't just about one person, they happen more often than we talk about. And if you believe that setting boundaries isn't selfish, that knowing your worth matters more than being accepted at any cost, stay with this channel. Subscribe, because there are more stories like this, real stories about what happens when people finally stop negotiating their own value. This story is fictionalized for dramatic effect,